Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jorge Coronado. I am Director of Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Northwestern and Professor of Latin American Literatures here. It is my enormous pleasure to welcome you to our conversatorio today, entitled Lynching, Extralegal Justice and Authoritarianism in Unrevolutionary Mexico. In fact, we are presenting two books of scholarship recently published on this subject. One from Gema Kloppe-Santamaría, entitled In the Vortex of Violence, Lynching, Extralegal Justice and the State in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, and another from our colleague at Northwestern, Paul Gillingham, entitled Unrevolutionary Mexico, The Birth of a Strange Dictatorship. I am going to hand off the emceeing of today's event to my colleague Lina Britto, Associate Professor in History, in a moment. But first, I want to tell you a little bit more about our colleagues. And I also want to highlight that today's event, while organized by Latin American and Caribbean Studies, is also co-organized by Noria Research, whose members are present here. I believe we'll hear more about Noria Research and our exciting collaborations in the hour and a half to come. So Paul Gillingham is Associate Professor of History at Northwestern and former Director of the university's Latin American and Caribbean Studies program. He is a historian of modern Mexico and Latin America, specializing in politics, culture, and violence. His first book, Cuauhtémoc's Bones, Forging National Identity in Modern Mexico, from 2011, examines nationalism through the story of a forged tomb of the last Aztec emperor. It was awarded the Conference on Latin American History's Mexican History Prize. He is also co-editor of Dictablanda, Politics, Work, and Culture in Mexico, 1938 to 1968, which appeared in 2014, and Journalism, Satire, and Censorship in Mexico, which appeared in 2019. He co-edits the University of California press series Violence in Latin American History. And as I said, we'll hear more about his new book in a moment. Gema Kloppe-Santamaría is Assistant Professor of Latin American History at Loyola University, Chicago. Her research analyzes the history of Latin American processes of state building across the 20th and 21st centuries, with a particular attention to questions of violence, crime, justice, and the rule of law. Kloppe-Santamaría is a main editor of the books Human Security and Chronic Violence in Mexico from 2019, Seguridad Humana, Violencia Crónica en México, Nuevas Lecturas y Propuestas desde Abajo, the translation, 2019, and Violence and Crime in Latin America, Representations and Politics from 2017. She has also authored numerous articles and chapters, as well as reports for the United Nations Development Program, the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, and the Norwegian Peacebuilding Resource Center, NOREF. Please join me in welcoming our guests today.
Thank you, Jorge.
Please take it away.
Yes, thank you, Jorge. And thanks to Paul and Gema for accepting this invitation. It is an honor for me to be here talking to both of them, which is something that we wanted to do for a long time, because, you know, histories of violence from Mexico and also from my country, Colombia, are plenty. Actually, both countries are kind of like known for their like tremendous and terrible levels of violence for a long time. So kind of like this effort to historicize those histories of violence and to look at the social and political and cultural history behind it is always exciting to me, and I think always welcome. So what we're going to do today is have a conversation. Instead of each one of them presenting their own book, we're going to be addressing very general questions that are, some of them are about topics that are common to both books. Others are just contrasting and the differences between these two magnificent pieces of work. And then later on, we're going to open the Q&A for your intervention. But please use the chat at any time that you have a question or a comment. We have our fantastic staff, Bianca, Danny, Cindy, also present here, kind of like monitoring the chat. So we're not going to miss your comments and questions. And then we're going to be talking for 45, maybe 50 minutes. We'll see. And then we're going to open to Q&A, to your comments, to your questions. So you can also use the chat to ask your microphone be activated and ask your question in person, quote unquote. So we're just going to start with kind of like a series of questions that will allow both Paul and Gema to introduce the big ideas and the big debates in their books. So in order to start, I would like to start with you, Paul, because in your fabulous and very ambitious book, you kind of like offer a general framework to understand 20th century Mexico. So I think it's kind of like the perfect way to start this conversation. And in that brilliant book and historical analysis, you set yourself that what you want to do is to analyze how and why, and quote, these are your words, exceptional political phenomenon, meaning the Mexican Revolution, grew into a dictablanda, a soft dictatorship, or also a strange dictatorship, which is the subtitle of your book, right? So can you please explain to us what you mean by a strange dictatorship? And also, why do you think it's necessary to use that terminology for a political system that you yourself characterize as being, quote, formally civilian, collective, and punctiliously electoral? So thanks for being here, and take it away.
Right. Well, first of all, a blanket thanks to everybody. If I named everybody who had contributed to make this happen and offered such a warm welcome, that would sort of exhaust my time. So if I could just extend it, I really appreciate all of this. And I also appreciate the fact that, having cursed Zoom, I think all of us have for the last year or so, at least it gives us the chance to bring people really from far greater distances than we ever have before. And at the risk of really irking Danny and probably several other people, I hope we can continue this on a hybrid model going forward, because it's excellent to see people from all over without the investment in ecological trashing and transport, people's time and general energy. So that's a really good question, the strange dictatorship. And I think, like many of us, titles of books are the final bit of pain in actually getting the things out. And this is a particularly difficult one for the simple reason that actually classifying the Mexican system from the revolution up until 2000 is extremely tricky. And the reason it's tricky is because it doesn't really fit any of our accepted patterns, to the extent where actually what to call it has been extremely controversial. And so there are arguments as to whether Dictablanda is too soft in the end on the PRI, acknowledges its long history of both visible and invisible violence that helped keep the lid on the entire country this exceptional 71 years. On the other hand, there are people who say, if you have elections, if you have regular constitutional transfers of power, if you have rule of law, and if you have an army which follows constitutional precepts, well, then you've got a democracy. Neither dictatorship or democracy, of course, really works. And in fact, Dictablanda came out of a major academic punch-up back in the 90s between Octavio Paz, who said Mexico is broadly a democracy, Mario Vargas Llosa, who said you must be joking, this is a dictatorship, and Enrique Krause, who weighed in with Dictablanda. Now, citing either Enrique Krause or Mario Vargas Llosa is not exactly a route to popularity for many reasons, and yet I think that Krause really got this right. And the reason I called it a strange dictatorship instead of a dictablanda in the title is because of the golden rule that putting words which are obscure in the title of a book will cut people's urge to purchase it or even read it. So what's strange about Mexico? Well, first of all, when you think about dictatorships, you tend to think in terms of either the sort of gaudy Baroque figures of personalist dictatorships like Trujillo, like Somoza, or you think of sort of institutional military dictatorships, especially in Latin America. And Mexico's strange because it's one of the only two countries in the 20th century not to have had a military dictatorship. What's strange about it? First of all, as you point out, there are elections. There are over 80,000 across the 20th century. Those elections bring a continuous turnover of civilian leaders as of the mid-50s, which is the end of my period. Up until then, they're mainly generals, but they're still elected generals. And so that's one thing. You turn over through elections, no matter how flawed they may be, and you have a constant constitutional rotation in power. Many people think that many people used to think that the PRI was staffed by sort of Machiavellian geniuses, and this is obviously not really true. But there was one great piece of institutional design, and that was the rule of no re-election. And this is observed, and this keeps that turnover, which makes this particular dictatorship strange. The next thing that makes this strange is the fact that the army, although its influence has been greatly underestimated, at the end of the day, stayed in its barracks and was not loyal to civilians across the entire country at all. As Gema, as Romain, and as Jason have all seen, along with other colleagues, actually the military have quite a lot of sway and independence as long as they stay out of Mexico City. They're not loyal to the PRI, they're not necessarily loyal to civilians, but they are dogmatically loyal to the president. This also is strange. And then finally, there's the strangeness that although we have discovered large amounts of violence we didn't see before, whether it be guerrilla or criminal, this still is violence which is contained regionally and which does not directly affect even 1% of Mexicans. All of this adds up to an extremely strange dictatorship. You might say, well, that sounds like contemporary Russia, say, where you've got elections, you've got a minimal freedom of press, and you've got a very nasty peripheral guerrilla war, or Turkey. But the key differences are, first of all, those are in our time, completely different global context. And secondly, Erdogan is going to leave power with either dynamite or death of natural causes, Tito Putin. This would never have occurred to peace that. And so this is a deeply strange dictatorship. And the final strangeness is that freedom of the press, very qualified, that we are nevertheless discovering, which means that people argue over just how dictatorial the regime is, decade after decade. All this for me adds up to something very strange. In the final analysis, though, has to be grouped as a dictatorship. And I think it has to be named, and not all my colleagues agree with me, and there have been debates specifically over Dictablanda because of its strange terminology, or no, strange ancestry, because it was used by people like Pinochet. But I believe, along with Octavio Paz and George Orwell, you should actually try and name things. That as soon as you get vague, you are actually threatening intelligent politics. And so instead of saying, well, we're talking about Mexico in the 40s, or we're talking about Mexico under the PRI, I would like to try and name it and then have an argument as to exactly how useful, accurate, sensible, etc. that name is. And hence Dictablanda, and hence in this case, strange dictatorship.
Thank you so much for that characterization, Paul, and especially for kind of like helping us to see Mexico in like a broader context and like in a comparative perspective with other nations. So Gema, your book is also about state formation, even though it doesn't go to talk about, political parties and, the high level of politics, but still it's about state formation in post-revolutionary Mexico. And you said that this whole state formation history is seen, quote, through the lenses of lynching. And then you argue that this extended practice of public violence, and these are your words, quote, reflected the dynamics of coercion, resistance, and negotiation that characterize citizens' encounters with state authorities at the local level, end quote. But obviously, there's many ways to look at these encounters between citizens and state authorities at the local level. So my question for you is, why lynching? What is its vantage point?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lina. And I also want to echo Paul's excitement, and I'm really thankful for being here and see other colleagues, and also see Northwestern partnering with Noria Research, which is a wonderful initiative. And I'm sure Romain and Jason will later on tell us a little bit more about this. So I also welcome the opportunity of being in dialogue with you, Lina, because I truly admire your work, and I do think more spaces are needed to think about Colombia and Mexico next to each other. So to answer your question, so indeed, like lynching, lynching is this collective, public, extralegal form of violence, which aim is to punish conducts that are considered transgressive or threatening by given communities. And as such, lynching does offer a unique window to understand both citizens' perceptions of justice, dangerousness, and defiance, their interactions with state authorities at the local level, as well as the ways in which violence was circulating in social relations. I mean, the ways in which it was negotiated, resisted, but also used by multiple actors at the local level, including just state actors, but also a multiplicity of actors. So lynching offers this unique vantage point to analyze violence. For too long, I would say, Mexico's trajectory of violence has been examined either in terms of statistics of homicide at the aggregate level, especially like at the national level, or through the lenses of more traditional political forms of violence, meaning electoral violence or violence perpetrated by state actors at the regional or national level, involving like political elites, governors, or like presidents, etc. However, indeed, like you were mentioning, like lynching allows us to see, like local politics, allows us to see like intra-community conflicts. And in this way, it really offers like a different perspective that goes beyond this macro narrative, that goes beyond these traditional forms of politics. And it's important because this kind of like what we know now as the myth of the Pax Priesta. I mean, this idea that the revolutionary elites, or the elites that emerged after the revolution, were able to legitimate the rule, that they were able to somehow centralize and monopolize the use of violence, is based on this vantage point. I mean, on this understanding of violence through homicide levels at the aggregate level, through this vantage point that looks at violence through like political lenses. And instead, what emerges when you study violence from the viewpoint of lynching is quite different. I mean, and I would just emphasize a few things. I mean, first, it becomes clear that violence was never really monopolized in Mexico or centralized by political elites. I mean, instead, violence was exercised by a multiplicity of actors, and including extralegal forms of violence. Extralegal forms of violence were perpetrated by state actors, including police officers, military, but also public officials such as mayors and judges. It was also exercised by these, actors that are in a gray zone between the legal and illegal actors, such as pistoleros, caciques, and other local power brokers. But it was also exercised by citizens themselves. I mean, by these vigilantes at the local level, as well as by lynch mobs. Now, lynching itself also involved the participation of some state actors, especially majors and police officers. So you see, through the lenses of lynching, it becomes clear that violence was never monopolized by the state, and certainly not by central elites in Mexico. Now, the second point that I would emphasize is that this doesn't mean that Mexico is a case or an example of state failure. Rather, the fact that violence was never monopolized in Mexico tells us how the state was forged in Mexico, how a state authority was forged at the local level, meaning through this kind of like negotiation of violence, its administration through different actors, I mean, through its exercise by a multiplicity of actors. And in the case of lynching, the central elites were not really interested in punishing this practice. I mean, as a matter of fact, in many cases, when lynching aligned itself with the types of politics that the state was defending, for instance, like anti-communist impetus in the 1940s, 1950s, it purposefully let lynching go unpunished. So as long as, you know, these forms of violence at the local level, such as lynching, did not threaten directly the political regime, as long as it didn't call for too much attention from the media in the center, I mean, in Mexico City in particular, or international attention, it didn't matter for the state and for central elites. I mean, central elites not only didn't have the capacity, but didn't really have the interest in taming these forms of violence. And thirdly, I mean, through the lenses of lynching, it becomes clear that while state actors, and as I said, police authorities, military, etc., were at central part in terms of how violence was exercised in Mexico, they were not alone. Communities themselves, citizens themselves were central in the production and reproduction of violence. And this is what I believe it's important to study violence through the lenses of lynching, because it allows you to go beyond a state-centered narrative, beyond a macro perspective centered only on homicides, and allows you to complicate this kind of like top-down or bottom-up characterizations of violence to see how, you know, really citizens are also central in legitimating extra-legal forms of violence, many times in complicity with state actors, other times in tension with the state actors. But at the end, this explains why, you know, the kind of like myth of the Pax Priest, you know, is really a myth, no? I mean, because at the end, violence was never effectively monopolized by state authorities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. It's really fantastic the way in which your books like really complement and dialogue with each other. And one of the reasons is not just because of the topic and the kinds of questions, but also because both of you are focusing on kind of like what you call post-revolutionary Mexico, meaning the decades between the 1930s and the 1950s. So my question, the same for both of you, but let's start with Gema first. What is special about this moment in Mexico? Why those decades are kind of like the critical time to analyze state formation?
Yes, I mean, these were central decades for the formation of a state authority in Mexico, for the process of state making, and also for the, you know, kinds of like the contours of the political regime that we will see taking shape throughout the 20th century. I mean, in the 1930s, Mexico had come out successfully, had transitioned from, at least formally, from war to peace. No, I mean, it had left behind the 1910 Mexican Revolution and its aftermath, the Cristero War, no, that 1926 to 1929 had come to an end. And even though you saw in the 30s a second Cristiada, no, like a second uprising organized by Catholic militants, overall, at least formally speaking, the country had transitioned from war to peace. No, I mean, so it was a key moment where the central elites sought to really centralized authority. I mean, promote like modernization projects in rural areas through cultural policies, but also through the, you know, building of public infrastructure, bringing sanitation campaigns, secularizing communities. I mean, trying to fight against the, you know, like what they consider the fanatic and irrational presence of the Catholic Church and the influence that it had. So it was a key moment in terms of like the process and the project of a state building that post-revolutionary elites envision. Now, beginning in the 1940s and 1950s in particular, these are the decades that have been key for this kind of myth of the Pax Prista that I was talking about. Because at the aggregate level, at least based on the statistics that we have, we see a decline on levels of homicides, especially beginning in the 1940s. And also we see, you know, for instance, in terms of the religious conflict that had occupied the first 3 decades of the 20th century, century, we see a detente between state and church. I mean, so instead of having a explosive relation between the state and church authorities, we see a state and Catholic Church reaching a collaborative relationship based on a new emergent conservative approach on behalf of the political elites that were now supporting anti-communism, that were also looking at Protestant populations with suspicions. So it's a new era, I mean, in terms of how the state was able to project its authority. And now, again, this is all at the aggregate level. I mean, and that's what is so fascinating, I mean, about these decades, because they are formative for the political regime that will emerge, and they are formative in terms of the kinds of penetration that the state managed to have at the local level, but not without facing resistance. I mean, clearly there was a lot of resistance, and lynching is a language in which communities express their discontent towards this presence of the post-revolutionary state. Now, the only thing I would say, or I would like to add, is that what is fascinating again about the question of, I mean, how these decades look like through the lenses of lynching is that, as I was mentioning, in 1940s, 1950s, you see a detente between state and church. I mean, and the state or Mexico leaves behind the second Cristiada too, that happened in the 1930s. However, this detente did not translate into an end of religious violence, but quite the opposite. So what my book shows is how lynchings motivated by religious beliefs, especially lynchings targeting Protestants and communists, became more prevalent precisely because there was this detente between state and church. So now these lynchings could even more go unpunished, I mean, and with a great level of brutality, because the political elites turned the other way. I mean, they were not interested in punishing these events because there was this agreement or this consensus around this conservative politics between state and church. I mean, and that is why it's important, again, to go beyond these aggregate state-centered narratives of violence and look at violence from a more local and capillary dimension.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Paul, from your point of view and your perspective, why the 1930s to the 1950s are the critical decades to examine? You're silenced.
Silence is gold, right? Thank you. I love the idea of sort of capillary system of the pre. The 40s and 50s are key for the simple reason that nothing is settled in 1940, 1945. And so our sort of generation is reacting against this historically unsustainable, but extremely powerful and long-lasting, as Gema says, the myth of the Pax Christi. And the idea of the Pax Christi was a relatively simple transactional affair, which is that this sort of very belated time-lagged social reform comes through in the second half of the 1930s. This is land reform for peasantry, and this is labor reform, which makes Mexican labor conditions some of the most favorable in the world. But this happens in the reforming stage of the revolution. And the result is this quite straightforward transaction of a new stability, a new allegiance to a regime in return for benefits given. And this is normally, well, used to be said, this happened around 1940. And then you have the really state-centric, statolatrous people who say, well, actually, 1929, you get the single party emerging. But as Gema points out, her work and mine both reveal that this it does not stack up. And the obvious question is, well, why do you have to wait 60 years to find that out? And that is a good question. And the answer is a lack of archives and a lack of interest. We got both archives and interest after the fall of the PRI in 2000. And we're facing this extraordinary question, this sort of perplexing question. If you lived in Mexico in the second half of the 90s, you looked at the chaos of Priista politics as it finally fell to pieces and said, well, how did this ever work? And the answer is because in the 40s and 50s, a very successful sort of modus vivendi emerged. And now Gema's point, I'm looking at the religious question. It's a very good one. This is almost a microcosm in that on the surface, you have a détente between church and state after the extraordinary violence of the 20s. Underneath that, on a local level, no such thing necessarily obtains. And in fact, if you look at 1945, 5 years after what's supposed to have been the sort of final settling of the counts of the revolution, on a local level, it's chaotic instability. You have high levels of political violence. You have high levels of democratic competition. And one of the interesting things about Mexico is an actual correlation between violence and democracy, a positive correlation. The two are not always opposed at all. Violence means that some of the local communities believe they can change something if they indulge in violence against the state. And the state in turn looks at this and obeys what is the political imperative of the post-revolution, which is just keep the lid on. Avoid the apocalypse of 1910 to 20 again. What this means is, with sufficient violence, communities can, in Gema's work, exercise their own sort of violence, or in my work, can actually overturn elections, veto really unpopular candidates, and even sometimes get their own people, undesired from above, elected. This deal, it's not a deal, this dynamic equilibrium comes from this period, 45 to 55. Then 45 to 55 count too, because of the removal of the army from national politics, not local politics at all. As Gema's work shows, as my work shows, a host of colleagues now, the military continue to rule large chunks of the countryside, but in the end, they observe the broadest possible rules of the game, which is no military rule. And this is one of the key things from 45 to 55. And this is one of the key things that makes the dictatorship strange. You have the military removing the military from politics. What I mean by that is the very top level and the military ex-presidents veto military attempts to actually seize power. And the clearest demonstration of how everything is really up for grabs in the 40s, nothing is written at all, is that there is very close to a coup in 1948. A serious paid up, dressed in black tie, military coup, which is prevented by, as I say, the top level of the army itself. How are things still up for grabs? You have a civilian president also in that period, busily trying to maintain himself in power the way Putin did. Nothing is yet sorted in 1945. By the time you get to the early mid-50s, you've really codified what's going to obtain for the next 50 years, which is this regular rotation in power, this hidden violence, but a violence which cuts both ways. There's popular violence, which establishes a sort of autonomy in some communities, whether it's autonomy to lynch or to elect. And then you also finally get this strange sort of almost libertarian approach, whereby this imperative, do not repeat 1910, translates into anything which is seriously resisted, let it go. Not universally, but enough to, at a national level, produce this improbable peace as a revolutionary society engages in extremely inequitable capitalist development. And this happens in that decade. And this is why that's the hinge. And it's the most important. There are three great hinge points in modern Mexican history. One's the revolution, one is the downfall of the PRI, and in between it, you have the 40s and 50s that interest Gema and me.
Thank you so much. Both of your methods, to study Mexico, I think give us a lot of lights to think about other countries. While I'm listening to you guys, I'm just thinking also about Colombia, just because of all the tools that you guys used that are, flexible to apply to other cases. And actually, my next question has to do with your method in many ways, because both of you pay attention to specific areas of the country using approaches to case studies and to regional history. And in your case, Paul, the selection was based on a contrast. The two regions that you analyze, which are Guerrero and Veracruz, are opposite in many ways, but you said, and these are your words, quote, they were both in a condition of profound crisis, end quote. So can you please walk us through your own process of selection of these two regions, and why do you think both Guerrero and Veracruz, with their particularities and specificities, still illuminate the history of the country as a whole?
Well, that's a great question. Of course, other social scientists look at the way we historians go about our work and think we are methodologically Neanderthal. And yes, well, in some ways we are, but in the other, the devil is in fact in the detail. And this is what we do. And at the best, we do it quite well. Now, looking at Mexico, you've obviously got this quite big place, which is quite diverse. And the classic cliche, but cliches quite often emerge because they are true, is that there are many Mexicos. And so you started off with people throwing out large generalizations in the sort of first generation who looked at Mexico, which were viable because there were only 3 or 4 historians looking at it. I exaggerate, but a relatively small group, and we knew very little. And then as time went on, it became obvious that studying at a macro level missed so much, and that in the light of many Mexicos, the methodological dominant approach in the 80s became case studies. Single state generally, case studies. Now, following state boundaries isn't always the best way of doing things. Quite often they are, like any borders, arbitrary. With our political units, quite often they're cultural units, and they're the best thing we have for simplicity of labeling. And so people from the 80s onwards chose generally single state case studies, which reinforced the idea of this massive diversity of social contracts, to simplify it. The difficulty is scaling up. And so scaling up from a single case study epistemologically is tricky. Luckily, we can do it increasing frequency because we've got an increasing body of work with which to engage. Scaling up from 2 states is, again, to another social scientist, just as laughable. But again, what are we going to do, as a New Yorker would say, right? And the reason for choosing Guerrero and Veracruz is really, first of all, as you point out, these are 2 extreme ends of the spectrum. Guerrero is poor. Guerrero does not have any say in national politics. Guerrero is, since before independence, going back to the 19th century, extremely conflictual. Veracruz, on the other hand, is wealthy, is connected to international markets, is politically far more diverse and stable for much of its history. And so this is sort of, let's draw the extremes. These 2 states are quite extreme, but in 1945, their similarities are great, i.e. high levels of violence, high levels of political instability, elections of 4 lost, 1 often quite bloodily. And they have so much in common when historically and structurally they have so much apart. And so the hope is that you have more chance of this rough and ready scaling up when you then bring in other people to work. And it's quite interesting to note that part of the settlement idea is that by the time you get to the mid-50s, these states are once again on very divergent pathways. Veracruz towards ruling the country effectively through 2 Veracruzano presidencies, Veracruz through really being at the forefront of development of the time, Veracruz getting a huge chunk of federal budget attention, etc. While Guerrero, we all know, there is some stabilization, but the indicators which we have are far different. And we know with the benefit of hindsight, this is where we're going to have the Mexican Kurdistan, the Mexican Chechnya of the 1960s and 70s dirty war. The bit where Mexico suddenly becomes far more tragically recognizable to Latin Americanists. And the last point I would give is, you can imagine the last 25 years as a rewinding of Mexican history, going back beyond that pivot of the 40s and 50s. And if you look at Guerrero and Veracruz in terms of drugs violence, the breakdown of a political system, massive outmigration, we've gone back in 2020 to 1945.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Paul. So Gema, you also focus on a particular region, which are the central and southern states of Mexico, Mexico City and Puebla. And contrary to Paul's case, which is a contrast, in your case is more kind of like a continuum. But you also give us a warning about this selection, and you talk about the problem of available sources. So can you please take us through the series of methodological challenges that inform your decision to focus on this particular part of the country?
Yes, absolutely. So the first thing I would say is that, this work is the first systematic attempt to study the history of lynching in Mexico and really in Latin America at large prior to the 1980s. Most of the scholarship that exists has been written by anthropologists, social scientists, some political scientists as well, that had focused in the last 30 to 40 years, no? And that have claimed that lynching is a new practice, no? That emerges as a process, as a result of failed democratic transitions, of neoliberalism, of the weakening of the presence of the state at the local level. So I would begin by making that disclaimer, because it's important to situate this work as really like the first that attempts to look at this history prior to the 1980s. Now, I face the challenge that lynching is not typified as a crime in Mexico. It doesn't have legal specificity, and in that sense, the judicial archive was of little to no use to me, because impunity runs high in Mexico for all crimes, and lynching is not the exception. But also, like, those very few cases that have been punished or that made it to the courts were punished under different crimes. Homicidio tumultuario, like tumultuous homicide, is one of the few figures that I encountered, but it's not specific to lynching. Some of these tumultuous homicides were something else. We're not necessarily lynching, but we're not connected to these attempts of to people to punish transgressions, but they were motivated by economic interests, etc. So what I did is that I had to then rely on a multiplicity of sources, including the press. The Nota Roja or the crime news were essential for my study. Also some mainstream newspapers and international media. And then letters of complaint written by families of victims, as well as by communities themselves, that were written to the president or to the state authorities, complaining about what was going on in their towns and the lynchings that were being perpetrated against agraristas, peasants that supported agrarian reform, or against Protestants, against communists, against suspected criminals, etc. Also security reports, and these were quite important. They were biased because they had the purpose of reporting to the central authorities what was happening in these places. So they were not completely unbiased, but at the same time, they really offer a very, in detailed analysis, almost like from an ethnographic point of view of what was happening in these towns. So these security reports were also central for me to understand these lynchings and to document them. And then like telegrams or other official correspondence, church archives as well. So all of this gave me a more wholesome picture. I collected in total, from, again, looking at close to 1,000, I systematized over 300 cases, 366 cases. Those are the ones that I really looked in depth in my study. And so this gave me this geography of lynching. So the geography of lynching that I have in my study is a result of my sources. No, I didn't go with the intention of necessarily focusing on Mexico City, Estado de Mexico, Puebla, but rather that is the picture that emerged from my sources. Now, as you say, I do recognize and I acknowledge that there is bias in my sources. As I said, official reports, were biased in the sense that these agents had interest in reporting certain kinds of conflicts in certain kinds of places. So those lynchings that entered the archive reflected that. Now, newspapers also had their own biases, and the fact that they reported perhaps more on Mexico City or lynchings that happened in certain places or that were connected to certain conflicts, where, lynchings were targeting socialist teachers. These rural teachers that were supporting the socialist model of education. The press had a particular invested interest in reporting on those cases. Having said that, I mean, I do find some, reasons to believe that there is a sound reason to believe that this is where lynchings are concentrated beyond the bias of my sources. And this have to do with the fact that these places, what they have in common is, on the one hand, a longer trajectory or tendency to reject the interference of the central state in local affairs. I mean, so these are places characterized by a political culture that is defensive in nature, where they distrust state authorities and their intervention in local affairs. And secondly, these are also places where you see or you observe Catholic and militant forms of religiosity. No, I mean, so in these places, I mean, and sometimes that intersects with the issue of defending the terruño, or the small lands. No, this kind of like defensive politics intersects with these popular militant forms of exercising religion. No? So now, incidentally, I would mention that as far as we know, I mean, from current studies on lynching in Mexico that are, by the way, only based on the press and on press reports, the geography of lynching is similar. I mean, lynchings today in Mexico are most prevalent in Estado de Mexico, Mexico City, Puebla. So my map of lynching in this historical period actually coincides with the map that we have today of this phenomenon in Mexico.
Wow, that is really, really interesting. Thank you so much. So,
go
ahead, Paul.
That, please. I think this is one of the cases where selecting an area, a region, really pays off precisely because of that concentration, that this is a good place to study this phenomenon. But I also think looking at this violence is very meaningful for broader interpretations for two reasons. And first of all, here you have an example of sort of successful mystification. It was a point of Mexican nationalism, whether it's in books, government speeches, or made mural, that Americans lynched people. And it was horrific. Americans lynched Black people, and weren't they barbarians? And Mexicans did not. Well, what Gema's work reveals is that's not the case at all. Secondly, and very counterintuitively, it also is part of this argument that some popular violence is actually stabilizing. Why? Well, because communities are left so often in Gema's stories to get on with it themselves, because that way, although the results are unpleasant, although this is not something a Bavarian state would like to see, if it's let alone, again, it does not cause trouble further up the sort of food chain of the PRI. And so for these two things, I think that this study of lynching is really very important.
Yeah, and that's precisely kind of like the last question that I'm going to ask, so we can open the conversation to everybody else. And it's precisely about the exercise of violence and violence as a kind of like integral part of Mexican political cultures. And both of you, in different ways, are very critical of those narratives about violence in Mexico that present violence as integral to, you know, how justice and politics are done in Mexico. So that's my last question. And let's start with him and then we go with Paul. What are kind of like the main mythologies that you needed to call into question, but at the same time, what are the, like, you know, grains of truth in those mythologies that you consider that it was important to highlight and to dig deeper? So Gema, let's start with you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, studying lynching, you know, clearly, you know, lynching is not a Mexican phenomenon. I mean, and as Paul reminded us, I mean, quite the opposite. No, I mean, especially for a U.S. audience, it kind of comes as a surprise to know that lynchings have a history. No, I mean, and that it has different motivations. That is not necessarily driven by racial conflict. No, that is driven by politics, by religious beliefs, by perceptions of crime, and that it doesn't look like the ways in which lynching looks like in the United States. No, I mean, so lynching certainly is a global phenomenon. I mean, in contemporary Latin America, it exists in countries as different as Guatemala, Ecuador, but also Argentina, Venezuela, Brazil. It exists as well in South Africa. No, I mean, more commonly known as necklacing in India. No, I mean, so this is really a global phenomenon. So it's certainly not like a Mexican exception at all. However, I mean, violence, has a particular history and particular geography, and it manifests itself differently in different places. No, I mean, so what is peculiar about lynching in Mexico? I would say it's two things. On the one hand, is the kind of performance of lynching, the sequencing of these events have a very recognizable script. I mean, so in ideal, typical terms, I mean, it's not that all lynchings look like that, but the ideal, typical lynching, the way it happens, the way it unfolds, it begins with a rumor. It follows with the tolling of the church bells, and this is not accidental. I mean, lynchings continue to be organized in this manner in Mexico. It goes a long way. It has to do with colonial riots. No, I mean, the way in which the church bells were at the symbolic level presented both the central importance of the Catholic Church organizing social and political life, but also infused these events with a communal meaning. No? I mean, it kind of portrays or projects the sense that these are not acts of crime, that these are not criminal acts, but these are acts of collective justice that are sanctioned by the community. So again, the rumors, the tolling of the church bells, I mean, the dragging of the body of the victims into a central recognizable public space, and the mutilations, burning, etc. No? I mean, the kinds of symbolic aspects of lynching have a very peculiar, like meaning in the history of Mexico. No? I mean, the cutting of ears, for instance, no? is something that we see during the Mexican Revolution and that we see surfacing again during the 1930s. So the grammar of violence is informed by a particular history in Mexico. Now, the second aspect that I would underline that make this history, I mean, the story of lynchings that I'm telling, a Mexican one, has to do with citizens' deep distrust in the state. I mean, the perception that state actors themselves have for too long bended the law, exercised extra-legal forms of violence, and therefore people's sense that the state will simply not deliver the justice or the security that they want. No? I mean, so this kind of distrust in the state authorities on the one hand, and on the other hand, citizens' proclivity to support these extra-legal forms of violence in order to first deliver a form of punishment that they believe is the only one that will stop these transgressors. I mean, be them witches, communists, socialists, or suspected criminals. And on the other hand, lynching emerges really as a language of negotiation and communication with the state authorities. No? I mean, where perpetrators of lynching are sending a message not only to potential transgressors, but also to the state itself. No? I mean, in terms of what they are willing to do if state authorities don't deliver the type of justice that they expect. And this justice is not necessarily within the law. It might be precisely these kinds of extra-legal forms of violence. So this is what I would say is peculiar about, or what is Mexican about the story that I'm telling.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Gema. Paul, what about you? What were kind of like those mythologies about violence in Mexico's politics and political culture that you needed to call into question, in which grains of truth you needed to kind of like preserve, emphasize, and explore deeper?
Right. Well, I think the question of violence is absolutely the center of the way we're conceptualizing the last now 70 years of Mexican history. After the revolution, and we're sick of dating it with the revolution, so just modern Mexico since the period we're looking at. The extent to which violence occurs, the extent to which it's salient in shaping politics in general, is absolutely central. This is what all debate is going to revolve around for the foreseeable future. In terms of what we found out, first of all, we found out that there was a lot more than we thought before, or than we were told before. And we could find that out through the security archives. We could find that out also from far more local work. And so in the past, we had a handful of village studies, generally of interesting, i.e. bloody places, like Paul Friedrich's classic of a small village in Michoacan, which told us that, there had been large amounts of violence, but the idea was confined to these specifically fascinating places because they were so dystopian, such good stories. We've seen now that on a national level, there is far more violence. And it's violence exercised by state actors, by, above all, the military, who have garrisons in 1 out of every 5 municipios. And there's this out of sight, out of mind quality to Mexican violence. It doesn't happen in Mexico City after 1952. And like New York, Paris, Roma, etc., if it doesn't happen in the capital in Mexico, then it probably didn't happen at all. We now see, yes, it actually did. It was systematic. It was generally low level, beatings, intimidation, but could go as far as raising an entire hamlet if the point needed to be made, or if it was felt that that was what was necessary. Again, this key concept to keep the lid on. It's not just military violence, though, of course. You've also got the pistoleros. You've got, who are quite often entrepreneurs who are closely connected with soldiers and with politicians. We're also just starting to see that there was more drug trade then, and with drug trade also violence. So that's the side which argues for violence, which we didn't see before. There is more of it. And this is where you get the and but. And the and but is that the story isn't just about violence, that in part, seeing the majority of Mexican communities outside Mexico City as being profoundly autonomy seeking. There's this Irish political party, Sinn Féin, and then the Nationalist Party, the Radical Party. Sinn Féin in Gaelic means ourselves alone. That could apply to more or less every other Mexican village. And violence exerted from the bottom upwards, to get proctological, actually puts a check on the state. It puts a check on state expansion. It puts a check on what the state tries to do that communities see as being against their interests. And that in turn means that violence isn't merely a question of oppression. It's also in some ways a manifestation of democratic urges, autonomy seeking, etc. And once we start really looking at violence, there is also the geography of violence. It is focused to a certain extent. We're fascinated by guerrillas because guerrillas are intrinsically fascinating, because it's such an important Latin American phenomenon, and because we couldn't know anything about them till about 10 years ago. And so we have had an explosion of some really good work on guerrillas. And our knowledge of Mexico is much richer for that. And yet, directly, guerrillas impact a tiny proportion of the Mexican population. And it's this broader, really complex system of a certain give or take and of a certain autonomy, where this weak state, as in Gema's work, actually sustains itself because it's weak, because it doesn't meddle too often. And if it does, it can be stopped, not always at all, but some of the time, within the end of threat of violence. And so it's a thread that runs through. It's not all repressive, and it is part of a far more complex, multivariate sort of equation.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that our audience have a lot of comments and questions. So please, we're going to do that right now. But before that, I want to introduce Jason Porter and Romain Lecour, who are with us as kind of like the liaison with Noria research. So Jason is a PhD candidate in history here at Northwestern, and he's a fellow at Noria, Mexico and Central America, also a staff blogger at Black Perspectives, and I'm a member of the editorial board of NACLA, which is perhaps one of the most important non-academic, although they publish a lot of academics, non-academic journal and magazine about Latin America here in the United States. And Romain Lecour holds a PhD in political science from the Sorbonne University, and he's also the co-founder of Noria Research and the coordinator of the Mexico and Central America program. So both of them are going to introduce Noria in the series on violence that we are kind of like collaborating with right now. So Jason, Romain, I don't know which one wanna go first. Welcome and thank you so much.
Thank you, Lina. Thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm quite humbled to speak after Gema and Paul. I think the seminar and the conversation is absolutely amazing, and I was actually typing my question for the next for the discussion to come. I will be extremely brief. I'm very happy to have this alliance with you, Lina, and with Northwestern on behalf of Noria and the Mexico and Central America program. The idea is really to open a space for discussion, for ideas, for projects, for research projects, and for different modes of broadcasting, basically information and academic research to a broader audience. And I think that's what we want to achieve with this alliance between Noria and Northwestern. Basically, is taking academic messages and try to translate them into broader audiences messages, but bringing basically I think all the theories and all the ideas that Gema and Paul brilliantly presented today is basically presenting and bringing a critical approach to what we understand about the state and violence in Mexico, to say it very, very briefly. And that's the work we want to do. And I will leave the floor to Jason, who will actually present the work he's been doing with us. Brilliant work, and I think it's an amazing illustration of the large panel of opportunities we have of doing this kind of stuff. So I will leave the floor to Jason. Thank you so much again, and I will start posting my questions to Gema and Paul right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jason. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Romain, for that, introducing Noria. And also thank you, Lina, as well, for the invitation to be here. It's amazing to be collaborating with two worlds that I have, my advisor and the committee members here. It's a really special moment for me. And yeah, to build off of some of the conversation that's going on, I think Noria really builds off of some of the things that I think Paul is already doing at Northwestern, which is really focused on the source material. I mean, he's mentioned several times that we can tell new stories today than we could 15 years ago because of what was released after the fall of the PRI. But that's still a battle to be made. I mean, that's still a battle to, attaining these resources, maintaining these resources. And for that reason, right in the beginning of COVID last year, when we were dealing with issues with the EPSA records, a lot of people in the Noria group were asking questions about agriculture and asking questions about the connections between illicit economy and illicit economy. And one of the questions I had been asking with Paul for a long time is, how can we think about agriculture, the Green Revolution, or the Mexican miracle as something that could contrast this myth of the Pax Purista? Like, how is that itself a very violent form that was quotidian, it was every day, it was broad, and it was multivalent, and it had many participants. And for that reason, I was in conversation with many people in the Noria group about, avocados and violence in Michoacan, or tomatoes in Sinaloa and violence, or coconuts in Guerrero. And putting all together, we decided that we could tell a story that pushes beyond kind of the narco violence or just state presence violence, or questions about where the state is. And kind of, I was really actually inspired by the title from a Black Studies scholar, George Lipsitz, where he talks about how racism takes place and that it's always locally situated. And I thought that violence takes place also was really resonant. And it also was resonant because the question that George Lipsitz was asking was an intramural one. It was a question about what the violence within the Black community, or the violence within a group. And in a very similar way, I wanted to ask about the endogenous forms of violence that are taking place in local contexts. That's not always thinking about how the United States or how the state or the military, but really thinking about it from the roots up. So I would, hopefully you can jump and look into the series. I believe we have a new text that's coming out tomorrow, super excited about, but I'm more excited about jumping back into this fabulous conversation rooted in violence and how it takes place in different contexts. And it's truly a pleasure to be here. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Romain. So if you guys go to the chat, you will see a lot of links to different websites and different information about Noria, their social media presence as well, the particular podcast series that Jason with Alexander Aviña co-edited. The link is also there, and the announcement that actually tomorrow they're gonna release a new text by Gabriel Tamariz, who I can see is just right here with us. So congratulations on that. So I have a lot of questions, but I think I have asked enough. So we just open for you guys. If you want to type your question, use the chat, or if you want to actually, you know, ask yourself, just raise your hand, and then we go by one by one with your questions or comments. So I see Barry here. Go ahead. And then William. So first Barry Greenman and then William Booth. Go ahead. You're silenced. Barry, you are silenced. We can hear you.
Okay, Barry, you should be able to unmute yourself now. Go ahead.
No, try again. Barry, you need to try again because we can hear you.
Let's
no,
try
just
someone
click.
else.
Okay, we're gonna text them and see if we can give him some instructions on how to do it. William, go ahead, and then we go back to Barry.
Thanks. That was two fantastic talks from Paul and Gema. The thing that, I mean, you probably guessed what I'm going to ask about, which is the role of the left. And one of the things I've been studying is why the left hitched its wagon so fully to the state apparatus, to the one-party system, even at the point in the Hinge period that you're talking about, where it became obvious that this was essentially an anti-communist government. And from the things that you've been talking about today, it strikes me that maybe the unpredictability of local alliances, negotiations, compromises, local violence made coming up with any sort of national leftist program that deviated from official party pre-policy very difficult. And so do you think that kind of, I mean, I know it's such a cliche, and you talked about how it's become a bit of a cliche about many Mexicos, but do you think the many Mexicos idea mitigated against a strong national leftist opposition?
Right, well, I mean, I'll start about that. And yes, I was not surprised when you asked about communism. I think you can actually, in part, see the fate of the Mexican left in quite personalist, conjunctural terms, in that you have a sort of natural constituency for a left that is let down. You have a mobilized peasantry, you have a very mobilized labor workforce, and yet you do not have much of a communist party. In fact, you've got a communist party which is so minor that the US embassy during the Cold War writes it off as being totally irrelevant. And this is not something US embassies did generally during the Cold War. And so why is that? I think in the personalist terms, on one hand, you've got a leader called Lombardo Toledano, who managed to draw for a lot of the potential energy of a militant left into sort of continual accommodation. And he's an extremely slippery character. He manages, though, in these formative years of the 30s through the 50s, sort of defuse and maybe divert, put into a different channel, the sort of leftist energy which could have led to a left which was not affiliated to the PRI. Because in the end, Toledano's, apart from its personal interests, key value was that key priista value, keep the lid on. Then on the other hand, you have Carnas, Lázaro Cárdenas, the ex-president, the totemic figure of the left. And Cárnas's key value is also keep the lid on. And he has the privileged position of being the last sort of revolutionary hero. And Cárdenas in power has been steadily revised downwards. He's not seen as that much of a radical anymore. He's not even seen as that much of a powerful figure anymore. But I'd argue that we have to a large extent underestimated his importance out of power. because with these new sources, we keep seeing over and over again, Cárdenas steps in the end, to sideline a militant left and keep a sort of left-wing corriente within the PRI alive and kicking. And Cárdenas has veto power across this period up until the 60s. Anytime a president wants to do something vaguely radical, whether it's in foreign policy or domestic, you'll find out now, oh, they went to see Lázaro Cárdenas. Anytime there's a presidential succession, you'll see, oh, you talked with Lázaro Cárdenas. As part of a broader, I call it informal Senate of ex-presidents, but Cárdenas is the key figure. And so the left has this, or leftist activist people who have affinities to the left, have this perpetual sort of forlorn hope that Cárdenas will bring the PRI back towards a more leftist direction. And what he does instead is keep the PRI from going hugely to the right. And so I think you can see it in terms of those two personalities. You can see it in terms of a classic sort of fratricidal left. And you can also see it in nationalist terms, that classic bit of pre-speak, exóticas, doctrinas exóticas, that anything which is too systematized, leftist and from outside, or indeed fascist, it's just not Mexican. And that's an extremely powerful line, and that stays. So there's lots of good reasons, and it would have been extraordinary, given so many reasons, if the militant left had ever really spread outside of a few key spots like Guerrero.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to what Paul said. I mean, that indeed you see, I mean, through the lenses of Cárdenas especially, you know, I mean, the ways in which pragmatism trumped anything else, you know? I mean, and you see this process of negotiation, for instance, with regional elites. I mean, the Puebla case is fantastic, no? I mean, the ways in which it shows how Cárdenas privileged a strategic relationship with the Ávila Camacho brothers, especially with Maximino, and how it turned a blind eye to the violence that it was occurring in that state against socialist teachers. No, I mean, and it left it happen, you know, under the eyes and the complete approval and tolerance of Maximino Ávila Camacho in the state of Puebla. So I would say, yes, the pragmatism and ultimately this political calculation on behalf of Cárdenas. And then at the more local level, I think we still have to do a better job acknowledging the conservative anti-communist undercurrents that exist in several places of Mexico, which intersect, as I was saying, with religious ideologies and with particular strands of Catholicism, but it also intersects with, you know, a kind of like defensive politics, a political culture that is, again, suspicious of everything that is foreign, of everything that comes from like central or urban elites, and that also fits into this suspicion of a radical leftist politics, I would say.
Thank you. Barry, your turn. Go ahead.
Okay, my question is the violence on the local level and electoral turnover really a safety valve for the Mexican elite to avoid, say, any kind of countrywide violence?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's the result that you have. I'm not quite sure if the central elites have complete control over it, or if this was part of a master plan. No, but the end result was, I think you're right. I mean, that at the end, it kind of diffused political tensions from scaling up. It was a convenient way in which political conflicts, intra-community conflicts were resolved. And where I would say that central elites had an agency or a saying in the ways in which this was done is that whenever it turned too problematic, or whenever it brought unnecessary attention, be it from central elites or from international attention, then central elites would get into or meddle into local affairs or into local politics. As long as it didn't touch upon the legitimacy of the regime or the stability or the apparent stability of the political regime, then central elites didn't quite care about what was happening. So I would say that yes, the ultimate effect was that these kind of low-level, everyday forms of violence, intra-community conflict, people taking matters into their own hands, ultimately did help or did contribute to the apparent stability of the regime.
Absolutely, I'd agree with that completely, and just add that I think that for the like the Victorians, you know, the Victorians, they had the deserving poor and then the sort of unworthy poor. I think the drew a very similar line. There was sort of the deserving violent, people who were protesting against overly baroquely violent caciques, or people who were protesting against particularly grotesque distortions of agrarian reform. And these were from the center, the sort of deserving violent. And then there were the undeserving, who were broadly guerrillas, anybody who threatened major productive units of the economy. I think in the end, the unworthy violent were actually in second place to the sort of deserving violent for the Brie.
Thank you. Will Pansters?
Hi, yes, thank you.
Hey, Will.
Yes, I'm still here. I'm hungry though, I must admit by now. Yes, I have a question that actually emerges from comments that Gema made at the beginning when you were talking about what comes out of the image when you study these whole processes from the vantage point of lynching. And you stressed, at least on 2 occasions, that it was not, violence was not the monopoly of state actors, you know, and so on, which I completely agree with. Now, for me, the question, and for you as historians as well, it would be also equally important. Okay, but if there are different actors involved at the same time, maybe working with each other or against each other, but what is the trend that you see? At the end of the day, would you say, on the basis of your material and also Paul's work on the elections and so on, and the role of the military, on the basis of the trend and the general, let's say, su peso relativo, you know, where was the actual weight of the violence coming from the armed citizens who defended themselves or struggled among themselves, or at the end of the day, the more from the dicta side and from the Dictablanda side? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I mean, this is an important question, and I don't think I have a definite answer. I mean, I continue to be intrigued by it, and as a historian, like trying to understand how this question has evolved over time. I mean, I think the historiography has gone from analyzing violence in a very top-down manner. I mean, thinking about the state as the actor that exercised violence, and, you know, like prior to the post-revisionist literature, we had historians or social scientists saying that it was like the ogro mexicano, no? I mean, this kind of like ever-present state that was repressing students in Tlatelolco, no? I mean, that was repressing activists, workers from the 1940s onwards, no? Or through the Guerra Sucia in Mexico, through the dirty wars. So it has kind of like moved from that state-centered top-down narrative to then paying more attention to hegemony and cultural questions. I mean, to now complicating the amount of actors that participate in the makings of violence. No, I mean, and your edited volume like was, you know, like open up that conversation as well. I mean, to kind of look at several other actors that participate in the production of violence. Now, I think the kind of like challenging part of answering that question in a definite manner is that, as I said, I mean, and lynching is a perfect example of this, we cannot really establish a clear-cut distinction between state and non-state actors. I mean, lynching itself, which traditionally is conceptualized as a form of violence that is exercised by citizens, it involved also the participation of police actors or public officials, including local level police officers as well as majors. And so, and here I'm going to borrow also something from Romain's own work, no? I mean, that has pushed us to think, or rather to go beyond zero-sum narratives, no? Is it the state, or is it civil society, or is it the state, or is it non-state actors? And rather recognize that many of these forms of violence exist in these gray zones, no? I mean, that you have also used this term. And so I believe that the challenge in answering this question question comes precisely in terms of how violence is configured in Mexico. No, I mean, how, again, like lynch mobs themselves involve state and non-state actors, and you could also make the same case for other forms of vigilante justice, self-defense forces, the acts perpetrated by pistoleros. No, I mean. Now, what I do believe, and I'm convinced about that right now, is that definitely violence was not exercised in a top-down manner, or at least not only, and that we need to understand understand it in its capillary dimensions. No, I mean the ways in which it was decentralized and perpetrated by this multiplicity of actors. But I'm looking forward to hearing what Paul has to say.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is, hi, Will. This is turned into some sort of ghoulish convention of violentorogos. So nice to see you. This is a really, as I said earlier, central question to our debates of what Mexico looked like after about 1940, no? And it's a real chicken and egg question. If we choose the period, though, from 1940 or so onwards, I would say, if you had to put your money on one thing, you would say that this was state-initiated. And why? Well, I say that because in the end, the state uses violence to form alliances with certain elements in local communities and state communities, and to exclude those that it does not wish to see. And I think that this causes reactive violence. It's the state violence or the threat of the same which will impose an unwanted candidate, which will push through a spurious land reform, which will bypass a law. It's the state violence which is there, either exercised or imminent, which then draws a violent reaction. And then the question becomes, to use an overused word, but it's a question of dialectic. In some ways, the two feed into each other. They are reactive, they're mutually reactive. And in the end, it becomes a question of who will blink first. Which side is going to accept the status quo, the new version of it? And that varies hugely from time to time and place to place. And that is an extremely vague and unsatisfying answer. But I think in this specific subject, most answers, apart from the great big one of how much does violence count, are going to be vague and unsatisfying. And it's the work of people like Noria, who I hope will give us more detail, more specifics to answer that.
Thank you. So we are supposed to be here until 1:30. So we're just gonna have the very last question, unfortunately. And I see here Danny Postel. You have a question? Go ahead, Danny.
Thank you so much. Are you sure there's no one else who has a question? Because I would gladly yield.
Let's see, who else? Anybody else? No? Okay,
right.
yeah, Jackie, yeah.
Jackie's
Go ahead,
Please.
Jackie. Jackie Stevens, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I'll just unmute for a second. So thank you guys so much for these really interesting conversations and your fabulous questions, Lina. My question goes to the basis of the ad hoc seeming, but not actually ad hoc lynchings. And if they are, like on what basis are people coming together in addition to religion? Like, are there clan loyalties or something that we would think of as ethnicity or other kinds of intergenerational attachments along the lines of like pogroms or the white lynchings in the United States? Or do you see these as more like local synecdochal, or sorry, like just synchronic allegiances and not diachronic allegiances? Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Danny, why don't you just put the cherry on top of the cake? And then we see we can answer both questions.
Okay, great. I'll try to do that. Paul, well, thanks for this fabulous discussion. I've learned so much from both of you, Paul and Gema. I'm curious, Paul, about the specific aspect of the adjective revolutionary in your analysis. I mean, this is central, as you explained, the subtitle of your book, and your notion of unrevolutionary. And I'm just curious about how, the went about, you know, what significance did this claim of being a revolutionary party, the Partido Revolucionario, this carrying the torch of revolution, how significant was this in the legitimation of the Pre's rule? I really know nothing about this. I'm more familiar with a case like Iran, which I'm writing about right now, which also calls itself a revolutionary state, but which hasn't been revolutionary for a very long time. And at what point does this term revolutionary become sort of like an absurdity, or maybe what, you know, the sociologist Ulrich Beck calls a zombie category, which is something that's dead but somehow goes on living?
Thank you. Perfect. So we have one question for Gema, one question for Paul. Go ahead, Gema.
Thank you, and thank you for this great question, Jackie. So in the Mexican context, and this is really in contrast to the history of the United States, lynchings are not driven, at least not primarily, by racial or ethnic tensions. I mean, there is a certain racialization or racialized. Lynchings are racialized by the press and by official discourse in the sense that they are portrayed as indigenous forms of justice, even though my work demonstrates that lynchings happens both in mestizo and indigenous communities in both rural and urban areas. But there is a tendency to say that these acts represent some backward, irrational traditions from indigenous populations. There were and there have been lynchings that are targeting certain racial or ethnic minorities. I mean, there was these attacks, systematic attacks against Chinese population around the 1910s, 1920s in Mexico. There were also some attacks against Spanish and Americans in the context of the revolution. But overall, and especially during the period that I'm studying, the one continuity is that you see lynchings being perpetrated against people that are consistently at the margins of society or that are considered to be transgressors. So the several cases that I study include lynchings against suspected criminals. I mean, this is the form of lynching that we see mostly today in Latin America, but also, as I was mentioning, against Protestants, against communists, against women accused of witchcraft. So consistently people that are perceived as transgressing social order. Now, there's also a politics of lynching. And the politics of lynching that I observe in the history of post-revolutionary Mexico is one that is linked with conservative and defensive politics. So overall, you do see certain communities that have a longer trajectory of rejecting either the interference of the central state on local affairs, or also the presence of people that are considered threatening or subversive. No, I mean, so overall, I mean, these are Catholic communities, I mean, or that exercise like popular forms of Catholicism, but also that reject social change, no? I mean, that are against the agrarian reform, that are against the socialist education, and that, as I said, are also against the presence of the state, and that lynch as well these suspected criminals. No? I mean, so lynchings against criminals that continue to exist today tell us that this practice is overall a form of social control. I mean, a form of keeping the boundaries of the community, of the safe community, against those people that are perceived as dangerous or threatening.
Thank you. Go ahead, Paul.
Right. Good question, Danny. Mexico's unrevolutionary from this period onwards in the sense of all substance of a revolutionary regime actually withers and dies. And so, first of all, the sort of old mixed economy is very much sidelined in favor of a straightforward capitalist economy. And it's not just that, but this is when we start getting World Bank indicators like the Gini coefficient measuring inequality. And this makes Mexico one of the most inequitable societies in economic terms in the world. You can't really call yourself revolutionary with that. Neither can you when the mass mobilization, which defines any revolution, is neutered in favor of a mass demobilization in which spontaneous demonstrations of popular enthusiasm are organized by the threats of losing your job on the downside, and on the upside by free lunches, mezcal, and cigarettes. Third, Mexico becomes deeply unrevolutionary in terms of its political elites. You have a series of, at the top level, the old generation of revolutionaries, left-leaning quite often. They leave official power, and their vestiges are there in Lázaro Cárdenas with his veto. Does it matter that people continue to talk the talk of revolution? Well, the line of the deeply influential cultural historians of the 90s, led by Gil Joseph, was yes, it does, because as he, Mary Kay Vaughan, and many people argued, you have a common language and common expectations when you're saying that something is revolutionary, even when it's not. And what we see, I think, now is, well, yes, but. And the but is, first of all, that while communities can say there's this trope, the revolution never made it here, which goes into demands for development, they're demanding development. They're not demanding wholesale redistribution. They might be demanding the firing of an odd local politician. So the idea that the discourse of the revolution lives on as a powerful causal factor, I think is questionable at the broadest level. And secondly, it's been argued that the talk of revolution helps this system survive through 2000 because it's so convincing. Things might be in my corner of Mexico deeply unpleasant, but if they're saying through all the state media that this is a revolutionary state, well, maybe someone else is. This is really difficult to sustain if you actually look beyond people talking about revolution and look at all the other things they talk about. They talk about democracy, they talk about development. At the very end, you have the slightly pathetic 1994 campaign slogan, for your family's well-being, which is somewhere between pathetic and mafiosi. So the PRI is polyglot. Yeah, talking about the revolution, even when it's unrevolutionary, it counts, but it counts only to, it doesn't count the way we used to believe. And we can't the PRI even speaks the language of feminism. They are wholly polyglot. And with that, thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paul and Gema, for your generosity and your brilliance. I truly recommend reading this book, these two books, kind of like in simultaneously, because they really dialogue and complement each other very well. Thanks for accepting our invitation and for, illuminating so much, not just for Mexico, but for many cases in Latin America as well. To our team, Danny, Cindy, Bianca, and Jorge, thank you so much for making this possible, and to Jason and Romain, that hopefully this could be just kind of like the beginning of more and future collaborations. And to all of you for being here.